So this is joint work actually with Paxson Fradi, who is a postdoc at the Redwood Center, and Dennis Gleiko, who is actually here. My problem now in the next 20 minutes is to condense a paper which is 60 pages long to 18 slides. So let me start with my neural coding problem, which connects definitely to Christoph's talk this morning. So Terry showed you basically that the receptive field of a single cell in the primary visual cortex, and this is how it looks. It's kind of an edge detector. But how you should think about it is like this. Yeah, so it's basically the cell only tells you something about a very particular point in the visual field. And in that regard, you can talk of a receptive field. So this single neuron tells you something that you can name. It's its receptive field. If you go to another structure in the brain, the entorhinal cortex, and you actually record the response of a cell, a grid cell there, then actually what you see is that I guess this pointer does not do much good. Then you see basically here the black dots are the spikes of the neuron, and you see that they are arranged on a grid in the environment of the animal. So in other words, whenever the animal is under a black spot here, you will see spikes of that one cell. So if you just listen to that one cell, what does it tell you about the location of the animal? Not very much. So in order to really figure out where the animal is, you have actually to look at the activities of many cells. And so this is what I call a distributed code, where really you need the context of the activities of the other neurons that you can tell anything. And of course, we know these are very efficient codes in terms of the representational capacity and also in terms of actually error correcting possibilities that you have with that. There's very nice papers about grid cells actually in the theoretical neuroscience literature. So this is my only neuroscience slide. Now basically the question is how can we compute with distributed representations? And of course we all do that with neural networks, and neural networks are usually defined in terms of classical neural networks by synapses and neurons, but we have heard this morning, maybe that's not good enough. We need dendritic nonlinearities and other things. But this is usually how we think about computing with distributed representations. There's an alternative which was proposed in the cognitive neuroscience community in the early 90s. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a single name. So you already saw posters and heard talks that actually use these algorithms, but everyone uses another name. I will refer to this as vector symbolic architectures, which was used in the more distant literature, but people also call it hyperdimensional computing, Pentti Kanerva, and Abbas this morning called it high-dimensional computing. So there you go. But it's all the same thing. And so what is it? So the difference in neural networks is that actually vector symbolic architectures are defined in terms of how distributed representations are formed, and there is an element of randomness there. So they are basically formed by drawing by basically pseudo-random vectors, large vectors, dimension 10,000, 20,000. Dimension is your friend for these distributed representations in a way. And then a vector symbolic architecture spells out operations that you can now perform on these representations to execute computations. And so there is one for key value binding. So you can actually take two of these vectors and form another one. And you can use this to express data structures like key value binding. And there is also a very important one, which is the representation of an item set, and this is done by linear superposition. And what you can actually do with these vector symbolic architectures in principle is use a linear classical superposition principle to solve a problem for many vectors that are in your item set. So in a way, it's a little bit like quantum computing, but it's classical, it's not quantum. So typical networks that actually do these distributed representations of, let's say, a number are reservoir networks. And you already have heard about those. And of course, we have here in the room Wolfgang, who is the inventor of of liquid state machines. Those are reservoir computing networks with spiking neurons. I think I can be here brief, but the idea is we again make an attempt. No, this is really not doing anything. Can I use to have a... Here, okay. So here, this is the encoding network, and the idea is very simple. You have here a time series of values, A of m. M is just the time index here. And now you basically, the task of the encoding network is to transform this sequence of inputs into a single state vector of the neurons in the network. And then in a fashion that basically later you can use another network that you, for example, could train by linear regression to actually read out one particular input that came in k time steps ago. And it basically works by the fact that the inputs are distributed to all the neurons, and that this readout network then really measures the network state in the right dimension to get a good estimate of this A vector, to basically return here an A hat. And so what I will tell you in the remainder of this talk is how you can dissect such networks using principles of vector symbolic architectures. And this is basically, it's an example. We have more examples of this kind, how you can look at a difficult recurrent dynamical systems formed by neurons, and how you can use vector symbolic architectures basically as a dissection knife. And so the operation which is performed by a simple echo state network in vector symbolic architecture language is described on this slide. So if you have two numbers, and now you want to encode them in a state vector, what you basically can do is just choose some random vectors, phi1 and phi2, weigh them with these numbers, add them together, and you can read them out like this. So if the vectors would be truly orthogonal, that's just a change of basis of the A vector, but it doesn't have to be exactly orthogonal. If the dimension is high enough and you use random vectors, it's approximately orthogonal. And now the only thing is that you add for sequences is you kind of rotate these encoding vectors by just multiplying them with w to the t, where t is basically the time step. And you can add all up, you get one vector, and the readout procedure then for the sequence is of this type. It's pretty simple if you know the phi vectors and if you know the W matrix, which you can think of as a rotation or a permutation, then this is a pretty simple operation. And so what I will show you in the next, on the next slide is basically how you, the nice thing is now that you can map this to an echo state network. I should say to a class of echo state networks that have actually here in the input matrix. So here now the input is a vector, not a single number. And this input matrix has pseudo-random columns. And those columns correspond to these phi vectors. And the W is orthogonal and has a long cycle length. This means that W to the T equal identity is the T is pretty large. And the beauty now is that actually this class of echo state networks with these randomized weights and orthogonal matrix are pretty easy to analyze. And so this is what I will just walk you through some results without going to the details. But what I should explain to you first, that we consider different cases of this memory task. So you can either think of the A of M, the input data, being just discrete symbols, and think of it just as binary and one-hot vectors. that is the symbolic data task, and I will start with that. But you can also think of analog values that are actually the components of the A vectors. That's the analog task. I will just show you one picture with that. And then there's two different memory types. One is a reset memory of a network where you first reset the memory state, and then you start to input the data. And then you can use this compressed state vector as a representation of the sequence. And the other one is a network that includes a forgetting mechanism. And I will look here at different forgetting mechanisms. One could be you just multiply your recurrent matrix with lambda smaller than 1. And the other forgetting mechanisms are actually squashing nonlinearities in the encoding network here. OK, so now we are basically ready to go. You can analyze now the performance of such a system by looking at the decoding circuit. And in the first question is, what is actually the matrix used here to decode the state vector? And this is this very simple vector symbolic architecture formula that just contains the W in the phi matrix of your encoding network. And then we have here a winner-take-all nonlinearity for the discrete case that actually produces here output vectors that are one hot and binary. And so now to analyze this, you have to ask yourself, well, what's the statistics of what comes into the winner-take-all here, right? So those are basically inner products between columns of the decoding matrix and the state vector. And you just have to look at the distributions and then you can basically compute what actually the probability for an accurate output is. So if D prime was actually the correct active one element, then you just need to make sure that the output or the input to the winner-take-all at the index D prime is bigger than all the others. And so now, because of this pseudo-randomness of the encoding network, there is a simple formula to do this. And so this is the formula how you can actually compute this PC, this accuracy probability. And the formula has to be, is not analytical, contains two integrals. So there is here a cumulative Gaussian, and here another Gaussian, here another integral. So it's two integrals. But this formula does all the heavy liftings for the pictures that I will show in the following. And so the first result that we get actually with this theory is that different vector symbolic architectures that have been proposed in the past, so one is hyperdimensional computing by Canova that uses binary pseudo-random vectors, holographic reduced representations, they use real-valued distributed representations, and Fourier holographic reduced representations, they use complex vectors. And actually, those can be used very nicely to map on spiking neural networks. I will not talk about this today, but this is what we use for building hippocampus models, for example. And so here now you see on, sorry, it's a little bit small, but you see here the accuracy. It should be 1 for perfect retrieval. So basically the plateaus that you see up here, that's perfect retrieval. And then as you store longer and longer sequences, as M increases, this will go down. The different lines here show you different sizes of the network. So as you increase the number of neurons in the network, then the accuracy goes up. And so basically, the main take-home message of this result is all these different VSA models perform the same. All these curves here look the same. Just this middle curve here looks different because this has actually this has actually here the different curves are different sizes of the input vectors. But all the other curves just look identical, and this has its reason that the sensitivity that actually goes into the accuracy formula is exactly the same, and the error basically scales with number of neurons. No, the accuracy scales with number of neurons divided by length of the sequence. So that's very simple. You can also ask, how does this compare to previous theories of vector symbolic architectures? Tony Blade in 1993 had a symbolic formula that you actually, well, you don't need to numerically evaluate it. And this is actually the cyan value here. You see, this focuses on the high fidelity regime on the plateau up there. And you see that it doesn't describe the plateau too well. It actually drops off too fast. And so we also in this paper show that you can actually derive another analytical description of this, the red line, which correctly kind of describes the plateau. In terms of information in bits per neuron, the old theory gave you about 0.1 bit per neuron, but it turns out if you do this correctly, it's more like 0.3. Let me now, so this was for the reset memory case. Let me quickly say something about echo state networks with forgetting. So for these, again, we can compute the sensitivity, which used to be for the reset memory just this square root of n over m. This becomes now a function of this lambda, of this attenuation constant in the echo state network. And again, we have a theory that works. The means here of the simulation results are well described by the solid lines, which is the theory. It's all the same formula. We see that there's some drop in the capacity. It's now more like so it's more like 0.2 or so. As long as it stays here at this high fidelity line, then it actually drops off and you get errors. And this has to do with the fact that the forgetting mechanism is not as good as really making a clean cut and discarding the data, resetting the state vector and starting anew. So there is some noise in the system still of memories that you cannot retrieve anymore, but that harm your capacity values a little bit, but not too much. It's about 30% decrease. Next question is, can you use as forgetting mechanism squashing nonlinearities? So first, and this is now where Dennis helped a lot, it's much more complicated to analyze this case. So you really have to look at the full Kolmogorov equation that describes the evolution of the state vector distribution as new inputs come in. New inputs that are not are basically can be described by a diffusion process, and you have then really to analyze this diffusion process. If you do that correctly, you can still use our formula. You can predict how much you can actually store, and if you compare now the different forgetting mechanisms, so here in solid lines is the lambda smaller 1 forgetting mechanism in a linear network, and the dashed and the dotted lines are the networks that forget through the neural nonlinearities. You see the performance is quite similar. There's a little drop if you do the forgetting by the nonlinearities, but it's a very similar. You can basically exchange these different forgetting mechanisms. You get almost the same performance. One last thing, the readout in the vector symbolic architectures is very simple and very fast because you don't need to look at anything. You just need to have these two matrices that were used in the encoding network, and you immediately know what the decoding matrix is. You can also do something more sophisticated, what is done usually in echo state networks. You can do a linear regression classifier in the output. And this actually translates to a kind of a new vector symbolic architecture model where you have a more complicated readout matrix here, where you need to do kind of also a matrix inversion similar to linear regression. But then indeed you actually get the capacity up. So this is for the binary input case. You basically, the solid lines are the simple readout, and you can see that you gain almost a factor of 2 if you actually do the more sophisticated readout model. But for the analog input, it makes a huge difference. Dashed line, the solid line is the simple readout. It stays below 1 bit per neuron, and you get up actually depending on the intrinsic noise of the system. For small intrinsic noise, you can get up to many, many bits per neuron. This is just an example for actually storing and reading out analog values. So here we stored image patches in an ESN, and so you hear one of these little squares is an image patch retrieved from the echo state network. And you can see that this deteriorates as you look further back in time. That's on the x-axis, and it improves as you use more neurons in the echo state network. And you can and the comparison between the upper and lower panel is simple readout versus this optimized readout. So, in summary, I propose to look at these vector symbolic architectures because they can really provide a mechanism how you can define a computation in them and map them to a neural network. And then you really know what the neural network is doing. So in other words, these echo state networks that I've shown you with these randomized input weights, you can interpret what they are doing in one cycle. They are performing a key value binding and a linear superposition. That's all they are doing. That's basically what you can now interpret. So it gives you a way to interpret the dynamics. And this is just an example. We have other VSA-based models that we can use to actually build models of hippocampus with spiking neurons and models that also exhibit phase possession. And further, more complicated computations formulated in vector symbolic architectures that really correspond to a reasoning, for example, analogy-based reasoning, can be implemented in attractor neural networks. So there's actually also a way how we can map more interesting computations than just this storage of a temporal data sequence into a neural network. So I propose this as a way to open the black box for recurrent neural networks to actually look into these methods. And this ends my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Questions? Yes, please.
So I want to ask, so you mentioned earlier, and of course this work, these VSAs or hyperdimensional computing, they go back to the 80s.
To the early 90s.
Early 90s.
Yeah. So it was basically Tony Blade and Jeff Hinton were the first two.
So I guess what has changed in the last 30 years? Is it the number of neurons now that you can do? Because I think I know these things scale. They're going to be a lot better if you can do many, tens of thousands or more neurons. So I guess is there something that's changed that makes this approach tractable now compared to when they first were introduced?
I think the purpose has changed. In the early 90s, these were proposed as connectionist models for cognitive reasoning. And now our mindset has changed. We see all these, you can use echo state networks to learn temporal structure in data, to do all kinds of things which are very interesting. But usually we don't have a very good grasp what's going on in such a recurrent network where information is just spread around many neurons. So I would say what has changed is we see now problems that we have not seen. I mean, they were basically developed and used in the psychology community as one set of models. There were other sets of models that did the binding operation so in these architectures, bound objects stay in the same vector space. The competitor models is, for example, the Smolensky model, where actually more complicated constructs get mapped into higher dimensional vectors. And kind of with the complexity of the object, things become more and more difficult. And they were kind of used to reason, for these questions, in the context of these questions, but they were not really used to understand neural networks and recurrent neural networks. And of course, what excites us is that this more structured way to look at what happens in the recurrent network could eventually be used to extract info, to learn some regularities somewhere in a data domain, unbind it from that domain, and generalize it. This is why we are interested in it. I think people just have not thought in these terms about these models. That would be my answer, but I don't know.